So we talked about framing bias, basically how do you ask the question. Question bias is which questions are allowed to be asked at all. The questions that get funded, published, and recognized as legitimate research are questions that academia finds interesting and manageable, right? Questions about whether kink engaged people are healthy, questions about the prevalence of specific practices, questions about the psychological profiles of practitioners. Those questions are the ones that are easy to manage. Now, the questions that matter most to the kink communities, questions about safety infrastructure, about specific needs of marginalized kink folks, about the clinical implications of trauma-connected kink, about the community level effects of sex worker criminalization on kink spaces. Now, those questions are a bit more difficult to manage and therefore underrepresented in the literature. So who decides what is worth studying determines what gets known. Research funding shapes research questions. The sources that fund social science research, like government agencies, academic institutions, private foundations, they have their own priorities, and those priorities do not always align with what the kink communities need the most. So a study examining the psychological profiles of BDSM practitioners is more fundable than a study examining the specific needs of Black femme kink practitioners navigating predominantly white community spaces. The first fits existing frameworks, it's a bit easier. The second requires a researcher with community relationships, a methodology that centers lived experience, and a funding source that values community relevant knowledge. All of these are unfortunately harder to secure. So this is why the question of who produces knowledge is inseparable from the question of what gets known. Academia does not study kink on community terms typically. It studies kink on its own terms, and the community gets partial, biased, and incomplete knowledge as a result. That's why we're here. We're going to do something different. Let's continue.